How Video Games Shape Gender Norms by Alex Aguirre. Video games have evolved into a dominant form of entertainment, influencing societal norms and behaviors, particularly concerning gender roles. From earlier titles that often regulated female characters to passive, objectified roles to modern games that present more complex, empowered women, the representation of gender in video games has been both a reflection and a catalyst for societal change. However, despite progress, issues of toxicity and harassment remain entrenched in gaming communities, particularly in multiplayer environments. Explores how gender is represented in both singular player and multiplayer games, focusing on iconic characters like Princess Peach, Lara Croft, Eli from The Last of Us, and the broader communities in Call of Duty and League of Legends. It examines how video games perpetrate or challenge traditional gender norms, the role of toxic masculinity, and the impact of harassment on marginalized players, including women and LGBTQ individuals. By applying sociological concepts like gender ideology, emotional culture, and toxic masculinity, this study aims to understand how video games both reflect and construct gender norms within the gaming world. The research question that's being presented is, how do gendered representation and community norms in video games contribute to the prevalence of harassment towards women and LGBTQ plus players in online gaming spaces? Here's a summary of the key topics that were discussed in the Lit Review. For example, gender representation. Video games are a dominant force in modern media, influencing not just entertainment but also cultural understandings of gender, identity, and social behavior. The academic literature reveals that gender representation and harassment in video games are deeply tied to long-standing societal norms, emotional culture, and in industry practices that often marginalize women and LGBT. Female representation has become more complex, with characters like Lara Croft and Eli serving as examples of strong, capable female leads. However, these characters are still often shaped by the male gaze, where their physical appearance is tailored to appeal to heterosexual male audience. Video games' narrative and dialogue also reflect and reinforce emotional culture and gender behavior. Male characters are commonly portrayed as assertive, rational, and aggressive, while female characters express emotion, dependency, and care. The division aligns with the social concept of the mind, body, spirit, where masculinity is linked with the intellect and control, and the femininity with emotion and physicality. These portrays not only shape in-game dynamics but also impact how players perceive gender roles outside of gaming environments. The issue of toxic masculinity is particularly visible in multiplayer and competitive games such as Call of Duty and League of Legends. In these spaces, dominance, aggression, and emotional suppression are often rewarded, creating a hostile environment for those who do not conform to traditional masculine norms. Taylor explains that such behaviors stem from cultural expectations of masculinity, which discourage vulnerability and empathy. These norms contribute to marginalization of women, LGBTQ plus individuals, and gender non-conforming individuals. Numerous studies have documented the prevalence of harassment in online gaming. Chen found that women and LGBTQ plus players are significantly more likely to be targeted by sexist, homophobic, and exclusionary language. According to GLAAD 2024 report, 52% of LGBTQ plus gamers have experienced harassment, and many avoid certain games or stop playing altogether due to toxic environments. Representation behind the screen. The lack of diversity among game developers also contribute to unequal representation within the games. The GDC States of the Industry Reports reveals that men make up 66% of the game development workforce, while women represent 25% and non-binary individuals only 6%. Without diverse creators behind the scenes, video game narratives are more likely to reflect dominant perspectives and less likely to challenge stereotypes or include marginalized voices. Historically, female characters in video games were often depicted in passive, objectified, or secondary roles. One of the most iconic and frequently analyzed examples is Princess Peach from Super Mario Bros., who embodies the distressed troop. This character type reinforces patriarchal norms by positioning male characters as heroes and women's as rewards or motivations for male action. However, meaningful changes remain slow. The cult of thinness, for example, continues to dominate female character design, reinforcing unrealistic beauty standards. Emotional culture in games also continue to glorify aggression while discouraging emotional expression, perpetrating toxic masculinity. To conclude the Lit Review conclusion, gender representation in video games continues to evolve, shifting from traditional portrayals of women as passive or hypersexualized figures to more diverse and empowered characters. However, issues such as verbal harassment and toxic masculinity remain deeply embedded, especially in online multiplayer environments. These hostile dynamics create exclusionary spaces that marginalize women and LGBTQ plus players, At the same time, commercial trends and DIE initiatives signal a growing demand for inclusive representation and equitable gaming experiences. Now, for the theory, emotional culture refers to the shared norms and expectations within a society or group about how people should express emotions, often based on gender. For example, male characters are portrayed as stoic or aggressive, reinforcing the idea that masculinity is tied to emotional control, whereas female characters are often more expressive or emotionally driven, reinforcing emotional vulnerability as a feminine trait. Objectification occurs when a person is treated as an object or thing to be used, valued primarily for their physical appearance or function rather than their full humanity. For example, characters like Princess Peach or early Lara Croft are examples designed to be rescued or visually appealing rather than to have full complex roles. This shapes how players view female characters as decoration or motivations rather than equals. Gender performance. This theory suggests that gender is not something one is, but something one does, a repeated performance based on social expectations. Gender roles are performed through behavior, appearance, and interaction. These performances are regulated by cultural norms and are often reinforced through media. Male characters are expected to perform dominance, strength, and control, while female characters often perform submissive, care, or seduction. Toxic masculinity refers to cultural norms that pressure men to be dominant, emotionally suppressive, violent, and dismissive of anything considered feminine. The concept doesn't claim masculinity itself as harmful, but rather than certain traits often associated with masculinity, like aggression and emotional repression. For example, multiplayer games often reward aggression and punish vulnerability. Harassment, dominance, and hostility towards women and LGBTQ players are extensions of these norms in gaming culture. I spent a total of 20 hours over several weeks, combined gameplay, observation of walkthroughs, community interaction, and chat analysis. Eli The Last of Us, I spent about 4 hours, focused on character development, emotional expression, and queer representation. Observed narrative cutscenes, decision making moments, and relationship dynamics. Analyze how she defies gender stereotypes and emotional norms. Lara Croft Tomb Raider, 3.5 hours, reviewed multiple interactions, classic and reboot, focused on physical design, role and action scenes, and camera angles. Compared empowerment versus sexualization across versions. Princess Peach, Super Mario Bros. Spent about 2 hours. Analyzed her role as the passive. Looked at game objective, dialogue, and dependency on male characters. Last but not least, Call of Duty and League of Legends spent about 8.5 hours combined. Studied male avatars, player interactions, and gender behavior in competitive environments. Observed real-time chat, Twitch streams, and YouTube comment threads. Coded harassment types, example, sexist slurs, and homophobia. Discussion analysis of Princess Peach. Princess Peach embodies traditional femininity. She is soft-spoken, nurturing, and nearly always portrayed as needing male protection. This aligns with the dominant ideology that equates masculinity with strength and action, and femininity with passivity and emotion. Emotional culture. Peach is rarely allowed emotional depth when she expresses herself. It's often through stereotypical feminine emotions like fear or gratitude, which contributes to emotional passivity and the view that women are not emotionally complex or capable of leadership. Toxic masculinity by absence. Although Princess Peach does not display toxic behavior herself, her helplessness indirectly reinforces toxic masculinity by giving male characters a sense of superiority and duty to protect, which discourages vulnerability and reinforces dominance as a masculine trait. Lara Croft. Gender ideology and objectification. Lara Croft's earliest designs were highly sexualized, with her infamous angular proportions and tight-fitting outfits embodying the sex sells approach in gaming. Emotional culture. Lara Croft's earlier games depicted her as an emotionally detached, focused primarily on physical action. In the 2013 reboot, her emotional depth was explored more, highlighting fear, pain, and vulnerability, while maintaining her toughness. This shift challenges traditional emotional culture where men are expected to suppress feelings while women are seen as emotionally fragile. Toxic masculinity and gender norms. In earlier Tomb Raider games, Lara's role as a fearless adventurer against her sexualized presentation reinforced toxic masculinity, where dominance, aggression, and emotional control were emphasized. Her sexualized portrayal became a source of critique because it aligned her with the male-dominant fantasies while still attempting to portray her as independent and strong. This tension highlighted the broader issue of gender performativity, where women in video games were expected to embody both strength and sexuality traits that traditionally belong to men. Eli from The Last of Us. Eli displays a range of emotions: grief, love, guilt, disrupting the notion that men must suppress emotions while women are overly emotional. That explains emotional culture. Toxic masculinity. Eli's journey highlights the impact of toxic masculinity, showing that both men and women are harmed by the pressure to conform aggressive, dominant behaviors. Objectification. Unlike many female game characters, Eli isn't sexualized. Her design is realistic, emphasizing her action and emotions rather than her physical appearance. Queer representation. In The Last of Us Part 2, Eli's relationship with Dina is portrayed in a normalized way, showcasing a queer narrative without tragedy or spectacle. Call of Duty and League of Legends. Toxic masculinity encourages aggression and dominance, fostering emotional repressive environments. Harassment. Women and LGBTQ plus players face high levels of sexism and homophobia in chat. Community behavior. Competitive focus leads to toxic behavior, where exclusion and verbal abuse are more common. Both games prioritize dominance, violence, and control, reinforcing masculine ideals of power and emotional suppression. Male avatars and players often dominate conversations and in-game actions. In conclusion, the analysis of characters and communities across a range of video games highlights how deeply entrenched gender ideologies shape both in-game content and player behavior, from the objectification and passive roles of early female characters like Princess Peach to the complex and empowered yet sexualized portrayals of Lara Croft and Eli. Video games continue to reflect and reinforce societal gender norms. In multiplayer games like Call of Duty and League of Legends, toxic masculinity and harassment further marginalize women and LGBTQ plus players, fostering environments where aggression and dominance are celebrated while emotional vulnerability is penalized. Despite some strides in more diverse representations and the inclusion of female protagonists like Eli, the overreaching issues of toxic behavior remains prevalent in gaming communities. While progress is visible, especially with queer representation in games like The Last of Us 2, the industry must continue pushing for structural and cultural change by diversifying creators, promoting inclusive storytelling, and addressing harassment. Video games become spaces that not only reflect societal gender norms but also challenge and redefine them for a more inclusive and empathetic gaming environment.